All right, hey gang. Well, today we're going to begin our discussion of what happens in Europe in between the two world wars, or what are often referred to as the interwar years. Okay, so immediately in the aftermath of World War I, this is what we're talking about. We're talking about Europe and the world following what happened there. So first of all, the student will demonstrate the political, economic, and social and cultural developments during the interwar period by Hey, you're going to describe the League of Nations in what's called the mandate system. Now, this is not a system on which you go to date with a man, all right? This is something else other than a mandate system. Okay, so the next thing that you are going to do is you're going to cite the causes and assess the impact of the worldwide depression of the 1930s. And last but not least, we're going to look at the events surrounding the rise and the aggression and what happens to humans as a result of the Soviet Union, Germany, Italy, and Japan, and identify their major leaders. So these are dictatorships that arise following the World War. So we've got Joseph Stalin, Adolf Hitler, Benito Mussolini, Emperor Hirohito, and Hideki Tojo. All right, well, first of all, let's talk about the League of Nations, okay? If you'll think back to the Treaty of Versailles, one of the things that the Treaty of Versailles did was it created this group called the League of Nations, and it served as a blueprint for today's United Nations. But the League of Nations, what it did was it tried to encourage international cooperation, and here's how it did that. It created a place where countries could get together and they could work to solve international problems and solve and settle differences all together, all right? And that was the goal, is that they could work together on common issues that affected everyone, or even regional issues that affected people in certain regions of the world. The whole goal of the United Nations, or League of Nations rather, was to keep peace. The cartoon here is a dog, and it's called the Dog of War. And the League of Nations is a muzzle that is meant to restrain the dog of war and to keep peace. Now, the way they did that was by placing economic sanctions on people, or on countries. Economic sanctions basically say that if a country doesn't do what they're supposed to, then nobody will trade with them. If they fail to cooperate with the rest of the country or the rest of the world, or go against what the rest of the world wants, then they will not be traded with. Iran is currently facing economic sanctions and having those sanctions removed because they have worked to develop nuclear weapons and they've been told not to. And so they're facing economic sanctions. People won't trade with them because of that. Okay, another aspect of the League of Nations was that it sought to manage the rest of the world. If you guys will remember, what happened in the Middle East following World War I was that the Ottoman Empire was destroyed. So now you've got this area that needs to be governed. And so the way it was governed was called mandates. Well, let me rephrase. It doesn't necessarily need to be governed. It's that the European powers said, hey, we can't trust these Middle Easterners to manage themselves, so we need to manage it for them. So what was created were called mandates. Mandates were essentially new versions of colonies, and it was a very paternalistic view that Europeans had to manage the Middle Eastern countries because the Middle Eastern countries weren't available to. So basically, they gave them big brothers, all right? And the who got what was determined in the Sykes-Picot Treaty in 1916. Now you'll go, wait a minute. 1916 was during the war. Well, France and Britain and actually Russia had kind of gotten together and they'd said, all right, here's what's going to happen when we beat the Ottoman Empire. Britain, you're going to get Jordan and what becomes Iraq, and Palestine and France. You're going to get Lebanon and Syria, and you guys are going to be able to manage those areas. You guys are going to be the big brother. You're going to watch over them. Now, remember, the other thing that you can get out of this is that because of oil and advent of the internal combustion engine, Middle Eastern oil becomes very important. And so those countries wanted access to that. So the Sykes-Picot Treaty, and you see that map, outlined mandates and how mandates were used to govern by France and Britain the Middle East. Now, the problem, or one of the biggest problems with this, was that America never joined the League of Nations. The American Senate did not like World War I. They did not like the Treaty of Versailles. They didn't agree with it because it involved the United States in international relations, and they wanted no part of it. So the Americans stayed out. They did not ratify, our Senate did not ratify the Treaty of Versailles, even though our president, Woodrow Wilson, was the one that proposed the League of Nations. Our Senate did not join the league, join that league, and this led to significant problems. One of the major problems, obviously, like I just said, is that the United States was not a member of it. We were a growing economic power. We had shown that we could support and we could hold ourselves up in war. But the other problems with it was that they had no real means of enforcement. They couldn't force countries to agree because the Americans never joined, and because other places didn't really take it seriously, and the League of Nations didn't have any real teeth to what they could do. The economic sanctions were all well and good, but often, as we'll see, what happened is that countries just ignored the economic sanctions and continued to trade. Well, League of Nations is one aspect. Well, what happened? So in the 1920s, there are lots of issues. There's a general sense of unease in the 1920s, particularly in Germany. But all of Europe is really uncertain. And if you like art, lots of really good art and literature comes from Germany. Remember, Germany had just been defeated, and they had this whole sense of, oh my goodness, we're not good enough, and lots of problems. And so what happens as a result of that is that there's a general sense of unease, and then in 1929, some bad things happen. And so in the 1930s, there's a big depression throughout the world. And let's look at some of the causes of the Great Depression in the 1930s. One of the significant causes were reparation payments. If you will remember, Germany was forced to make reparation payments to the Allies. And so the French really exacted this toll, and they wanted those reparation payments for the war. Because the reparation payments were so high, it often caused German currency to really be devalued. You see kids here playing with the money and stacking it up like they're toys. And those are bricks of money, guys. That's a big pack of money. You see a woman here burning the German marks as a way to keep warm. And also the dominance of the United States industrial sector. Europe's economy following the World War was completely and totally decimated, was really destroyed. Well, Americans began to pick up the slack. Well, the problem with that was once European industrialism kicked back, or industry came back, now the Americans had a lot too much stuff. So you could argue that Americans had produced too much stuff and there was overproduction, too much stuff on supply. Or you could just say that there wasn't enough demand because people didn't have money. Okay. Also, countries began not cooperating in the later 1920s, and they began placing what are called protective tariffs on themselves. And what they did, because the European economy started slowing down, they started placing tariffs on goods coming into their country from other countries. The problem with that is that it decreases world trade, and it causes the price of goods to increase. And so people had less money in their pocket. So people were hurt at home, and then people were hurt also other countries as well. And that caused a lot of hostility between countries. There were also too many loans given out. Banks made out a lot of loans internationally, not just in the United States, but internationally, banks made too many loans. They spread themselves too thin. And one of the most significant loans was part of the Dawes Plan. Because Germany was having such a hard time making its reparation payments, they went to Americans and they said, okay, we're having some issues here. We're having some problems. And Dawes, the Secretary of State for the U.S., said, okay, we're going to make you guys loans, and we're going to give you some money, and we're going to help you pay this debt, but you're going to help us, but you're going to pay back your loans over time. Well, the 1920s weren't terrible, but in 1929, the U.S. stock market crashed. And this marks a significant issue, marks the real beginning of the Great Depression of the 1930s. And what happens, and one of the biggest reasons, was that too many people were buying on margin. Buying on margin is the idea that basically you're taking out a loan to invest in a stock. And that's basically like taking out a loan to gamble, all right? And that doesn't work out real well. If the gamble doesn't pay off, if your stock price don't increase, then you don't make money and you can't pay back your loan, okay? And because there were too many loans made, then people couldn't make their loan payments. And so when the stock market crashed in 1929, people began to lose money. They began to lose faith in the capitalist system. They began to lose money and couldn't repay their loans. So here's the impact that the Great Depression had on the world. Massive worldwide unemployment struck the world. Unemployment peaks in 1933. It gradually rises steadily, and this is global unemployment that you see in the chart. Almost 25% of the population were unemployed. Now, the Great Recession of 2008 saw really high unemployment, but very few countries saw 25% unemployment. The U.S. never got that high, never got anywhere close to that. The high 25% unemployment was kind of the standard in the 1930s, or peaking rather in 1933. And in fact, it didn't go down below 10% unemployment until the World War started. Also, banks began to fail because they had given out so many loans. They didn't have enough in their stock. And because people were now losing their jobs, they couldn't make their loan payments, and banks began to falter and fall apart. Because of this, world trade began to collapse. Countries began to want to protect their own economy. They did not want to trade with other countries. They wanted to put, like I said, protective tariffs on their own goods to make put people to work in their own countries, and people began to stop trading with others internationally, and that's a really negative thing. And last but not least, it led to the rise of dictators. And what these dictators did is they created scapegoats. And they said certain groups of people are to blame for our problems. In Germany, it was the Jews. In Russia, it was capitalists. In Italians, it was in Italy, it was people that had led to the downfall of Italian society. And those people were blamed for the issues. Many countries, dictators sought to blame a certain group or different groups for their problems. And the people began to believe them. They would basically say, these people, whoever those people were, it varied from country to country, are the problem and they are to blame. And so dictators began to rise in those countries as a result of the Great Depression. We'll talk more about the dictators tomorrow. This was a long video, so bye.